June 1988, 22-year-old Marie Wilks found herself stranded on the hard shoulder of the M50, 7.5 months pregnant with her baby son and 11-year-old sister waiting in the car behind her. She walked half a mile to an emergency telephone and called for help. She should have been back within minutes. Instead, she vanished. Somewhere between a broken-down car and an SOS phone on one of Britain's busiest motorways, Marie disappeared without a trace. 2 days later, her body would be discovered, hidden in undergrowth just 3 miles away. A man was eventually convicted of her murder. Then that conviction was overturned. Nearly 4 decades later, the killer has never been brought to justice. This is the haunting and deeply disturbing case of Marie Wilks. Welcome to Crimes That Haunt Us, where the coldest cases are never forgotten. Subscribe now and join us for a new investigation every 2 weeks. Marie Patricia Wilks came into this world on the 30th of March 1966. She worked as a Red Cross nurse and was married to Adrian Wilks, a carpenter and part-time cadet instructor. The couple lived at Ambleside Drive in Warndon, Worcester. At the time of her murder, Marie was 7.5 months pregnant and was already mother to a 13-month son named Mark. Marie had a younger sister, aged 11, named Georgina Goff, who lived with their parents at Dines Green in Worcester. There is not much publicly available information on Marie's early life, as is quite common in older cold cases. Having only recently passed her driving test, she lacked confidence behind the wheel and preferred to avoid motorways whenever possible. She drove a beige Morris Marina, registration WAB894V. On the 18th of June 1988, Marie drove to her parents' home and collected Georgina. Together, along with baby Mark, they travelled to the army camp at Sidman's Yat in Herefordshire to visit Adrian, who was attending a territorial army camp in the Forest of Dean. Into the evening, as Marie and her young passengers made the journey home, disaster struck. Ironically, Marie had wanted to avoid the motorway altogether because of her anxiety as a relatively new driver. She had initially attempted to use alternative roads but had become lost and, out of desperation, she joined the dreaded M50 motorway. But as she drove along, steam suddenly began pouring from beneath the bonnet of her Morris Marina. Marie slowed down in an attempt to reduce the problem, but it made no difference. Moments later, the engine failed completely. She pulled onto the hard shoulder and raised the bonnet to look at the engine before returning back to the car. She then grabbed some loose change from the dashboard, then told her sister Georgina to look after the baby while she went to find an SOS telephone. Marie set off on foot along the motorway hard shoulder. After walking roughly half a mile, she reached SOS telephone 2076B, an emergency phone connected directly to West Mercia Police. She was wearing her pink and white striped maternity dress and appeared heavily pregnant. At 7:37 p.m., she used the phone and spoke with the police. She explained that the oil warning light had come on and she had broken down on the motorway. Marie then asked officers could they contact her parents. She provided the number for her father, Terry Goff, and requested that he come and collect her. The police were unable to contact Marie's father. Over the next 4 minutes, police attempted to speak to Mary, but there was no response. All they could hear was the constant roar of motorway traffic whizzing by in the background. The receiver had apparently been left off the hook. Marie was gone. Meanwhile, back at the stranded Morris Marina, Georgina was becoming increasingly anxious. Taking baby Mark with her, she decided to set off on foot in search of her sister. When she reached the emergency telephone, she found the receiver hanging loose. She was unable to get the phone to work and eventually decided to turn back and head towards the car. It was then that a white car carrying a man, his wife, and their 3 children stopped beside her. The man then asked Georgina where her mother was. Georgina then explained to the man that her sister had gone off to use the emergency phone because their car had broken down. The man asked the girl if they had any spanners before looking into the boot of the Morris Marina, looking for any other tools that might help repair the engine, but there were none available. Georgina asked the wife if she had change for 50 pence. The wife didn't, but she handed Georgina 2 10-pence coins in case she needed to use the telephone again. The family then continued on their journey, but concerned by what they had witnessed, started the next convenient location and arranged for a breakdown recovery vehicle to attend. As traffic thundered past on the motorway, Georgina's worry continued to grow. Once again, she walked back towards the emergency phone looking for her sister, but Marie had simply vanished. A short time later, a police patrol car discovered Georgina walking along the hard shoulder carrying her baby nephew. Officers immediately questioned why a young girl was alone beside a motorway and where the adults were. Once again, Georgina explained what had happened. Her sister had gone to make a telephone call and never returned. Police began coordinating a search operation almost immediately. The discovery of the dangling receiver caused particular concern. So too did the fact that a heavily pregnant woman had been absent for such a prolonged period after leaving her infant son in the care of her 11-year-old sister. Something did not feel right. Concern quickly escalated. It was a particularly hot evening and traffic levels were heavy. The police helicopter, equipped with heat-seeking technology, was summoned and deployed, but the unusually warm conditions severely limited its effectiveness. A major search effort then began. More than 50 officers, tracker dogs, foot patrols, and police vehicles spread out across the surrounding area in increasingly desperate attempts to locate Marie, yet there was no sign of her. Searches continued throughout the night and into the following day. Police launched extensive media appeals through newspapers, television, and radio. Witnesses began contacting the incident room with reports of a grey-colored vehicle parked near the emergency telephone. Others recalled seeing Marie walking along the hard shoulder shortly before she disappeared. Privately, detectives began considering a grim possibility. Marie Wilks may have been abducted. Her husband Adrian issued emotional appeals for information. Young Georgina bravely recounted the final moments she had shared with her sister. How could a heavily pregnant mother simply vanish from the side of a busy motorway? As the hours turned into days, fear gripped both the investigation and the wider public. Increasingly, detectives began convinced that something sinister had happened. On the 20th of June, investigators travelled to London to interview ITN news editor David Nicholas after he came forward claiming he had seen Marie on the M50 shortly before her disappearance. Nicholas recalled seeing her using the emergency telephone with a man standing nearby. He also remembered passing a beige vehicle parked on the hard shoulder. But at the time, nothing about the scene had struck him as unusual. Neither individual appeared distressed, and he assumed that they were together. Unfortunately, he is unable to provide a useful description of the man. His account was not the only one. Multiple reports had been received describing a man and a vehicle near Marie as she used the emergency telephone, but the descriptions remained frustratingly vague. It would take 2 agonizing days before a devastating development transformed a missing person investigation into a murder inquiry. At 5:55 p.m. on the 20th of June, police discovered the body of Marie Wilks. She was found at the foot of a grassy embankment, partially concealed by undergrowth just off the M50 near the village of Ripple, approximately 3 miles east of the emergency telephone where she had last been seen alive. Marie had been stabbed once in the neck. There were no immediate, obvious signs of any sexual assault. Detectives quickly concluded that she had likely been abducted whilst using the emergency phone before being murdered elsewhere and discarded near the motorway. Forensic investigators examined the area above where her body had been found. It appeared that a vehicle had recently reversed into a nearby crash barrier. Detectives also discovered a 20-foot tire mark on the road above the deposition site. Police theorized that the killer may have caused the damage while attempting to conceal his actions from passing motorists as he disposed of Marie's body. A major murder investigation was formally launched. Investigators then revealed that traces of blood had actually been discovered at the emergency telephone kiosk the previous day while the case was still being treated as a missing person inquiry. Detectives rejected the media's suggestions that they had kept this private for operational reasons. Detectives described the killing as savage, sadistic, and apparently motiveless. Their belief was that Marie had fallen victim to an opportunistic predator. They warned that if this killer was not caught, he could strike again. A post-mortem examination soon established the full horror of what had happened. Marie had died from a single stab wound to the neck that severed the jugular vein, causing catastrophic blood loss. The weapon was believed to have been a single-edged knife. The beautiful unborn child she had been expecting in just 6 weeks' time was also confirmed dead. Examiners further discovered that Marie had suffered a fractured jaw, believed to have been caused by a forceful blow from a punch or perhaps a kick. Investigators concluded that she had likely been attacked shortly after making the emergency call at 7:37 p.m. and abducted into a vehicle before being murdered. The entire sequence of events may have unfolded in a matter of minutes, no more than 15. Over 100 officers began the painstaking task of conducting fingertip searches along the M50, concentrating both on the emergency telephone kiosk where Marie was believed to have been abducted and the location where her body had been discovered. Detectives were also searching for the single-edged knife thought to have been used in the murder. Meanwhile, the recording of Marie's call to West Mercia police was sent away for forensic enhancement in the hopes that investigators might detect a voice, sound, or clue that had previously gone unnoticed. This effort ultimately would yield no results. By this stage, detectives had developed a working theory of the crime. They believed Marie had been attacked while speaking on the emergency telephone, explaining the sudden absence mid-call, then forced into a waiting vehicle and driven away from the scene. She was then stabbed before her body was discarded beside the motorway. On the 22nd of June, police issued a public appeal to help identify a vehicle seen parked near the body deposition site at around 7:40 p.m. on the evening of the 18th of June. Significantly, detectives had also received reports of what appeared to be the same vehicle near the emergency telephone where Marie had made her final call. The car was described as a larger-than-average family saloon car in good condition, silver or grey in its color, with an item of clothing seen hanging in the back seat. And around this time, police in Aberystwyth briefly detained and questioned 2 men who had returned a rented silver Austin vehicle matching the general description of the car seen on the M50. Investigators' attention had been drawn to the vehicle after blood was discovered inside it by staff. But the driver explained that his passenger had suffered a perforated eardrum while traveling in the car and insisted that neither of them had any connection to the murder of Marie Wilks. After examining the circumstances and checking their movements, detectives appeared satisfied with the explanation and their geographical alibis. These men are eliminated from the inquiry. On the 24th of June, detectives released an eerie artist's impression of the man they wished to trace in connection with the murder. He was described as white, early 20s, with thin and prominent facial features, a long narrow nose, and a youthful appearance. The most striking detail was his hair. Witnesses described it as blonde, cut in a modern crew-cut style with yellow or orange highlights. He was believed to have been wearing a blue and white striped shirt and may have also been dressed in blue trousers. Several witnesses remarked that he appeared unusually smart and well presented, as though he was dressed for a night out. Witnesses claimed to have seen the man both near the emergency telephone kiosk and standing close to Marie shortly before she vanished. The vehicle associated with him was again described as a silver-grey saloon car. The release of the identikit generated an immediate and swift response. The following day, 25th of June, newspapers reported that an undisclosed number of arrests had already been made at locations across Britain following the publication of the artist's impression. As the investigation widened, police began pursuing leads far beyond England. In Dublin, Gardaí contacted Scotland Yard after reports emerged of a possible sighting of the blonde-haired suspect in a pub in Dunleary. Witnesses claimed a young man with blonde spiked hair and an English accent had been drinking in the Schooner pub when other patrons remarked on his resemblance to the man featured in the newspapers. According to those present, he reacted immediately. The man allegedly fled the pub in haste, knocking over a woman and sending drinks crashing from a nearby table as he escaped. At the request of British investigators, Gardaí recovered the pint glass he had been using in the hope that fingerprints of forensic evidence might prove useful. Meanwhile, back in the UK, attention was increasingly focusing on one particular suspect. In South Wales, detectives had arrested 32-year-old nightclub doorman Eddie Browning. Browning worked as a bouncer at the Alan Evans Club in Rhondda and had been apprehended in Pentre, mid Glamorgan. A married father of one, he lived with his wife Julie, who was herself 7 months pregnant, at Vicarage Terrace in Rhondda. As Browning was questioned, police simultaneously launched an extensive search of his home in Treorchy, carrying out excavations and forensic examinations. Detectives obtained additional time to hold him for questioning, securing an extension through Worcester Magistrates Court. It would later emerge that numerous members of the public had contacted police after seeing the identikit image, convinced it depicted Browning. Among them was fellow nightclub doorman Kenneth Latton, who worked alongside him at the same club. Latton told the police that Browning was a violent individual who drove a silver Renault, regularly carried a knife, and was known to have connections within the Welsh criminal underworld. He had also driven to Aberdeen on the evening of the murder. As investigations dug deeper into Browning's background, the case against him appeared to gather momentum. On the 26th of June, police staged a highly emotional reconstruction of Marie Wilks' final known movements in the hope of triggering the memories of motorists who had travelled the M50 that evening. First, investigators positioned a beige Morris Marina on the hard shoulder to represent Marie's stranded vehicle. Further along the motorway, a female police officer dressed in clothing identical to Marie's stood at the emergency telephone, recreating her final known actions. Then, approximately 3 miles farther along the route, police parked a grey Renault 21 near the location where Marie's body had been discovered. Detectives believed it closely resembled the type of vehicle the killer may have been driving. This reconstruction generated widespread publicity and renewed appeals for information. On the 27th of June, detectives then made a fresh appeal through the media to trace a mystery witness described as a man with a Scottish accent. Investigators revealed that he had contacted police on 3 separate occasions and was believed to possess information of significant importance to the inquiry. His most recent call had come on the 24th of June. One officer publicly stated, "He knows how important he is to this inquiry." Determined to find him, detectives then travelled to Aberdeen and worked alongside Grampian police in an effort to identify and locate the elusive caller. On the 28th of June, suspect Eddie Browning was placed in an identity parade for witnesses to examine. At the same time, his silver Renault 25 was seized and transported to a forensic laboratory for detailed examination. Investigators also revealed a significant detail about Browning's movements on the night of the murder. According to their inquiries, he had unexpectedly driven to Aberdeen on the evening Marie Wilks disappeared, staying overnight with a friend before making the journey back to South Wales the following day. The timing immediately attracted the attention of detectives. The following day, June 29th, Browning appeared before Worcester Magistrates Court, charged with the murder of Marie Wilks. The hearing itself was brief. After the charge was formally read, Browning was swiftly escorted away as the investigation continued. Just weeks later, on the 20th of July, family, friends, and members of the local community gathered to mourn the deaths of Marie Wilks and her unborn son. The funeral was attended by a packed congregation. In one of the most heartbreaking scenes of the entire case, Marie's grieving husband Adrian walked from the church hand in hand with 11-year-old Georgina as they followed the coffin. For those closest to Marie, life would never be the same again. As preparations began for trial, a far darker picture of the man accused of her murder started to emerge. Eddie Browning had built a reputation for himself throughout the Welsh valleys. He enjoyed being known as a hard man. Friends and acquaintances described him as a brawler, a womanizer, and someone who openly despised the police. A former member of the Welsh Guards, Browning was heavily involved in bodybuilding and martial arts. His first wife, Jane, had eventually left him, citing both his infidelity and violent behavior. On one occasion, it was alleged that he dangled their toddler son upside down over a banister and threatened to drop him. In 1980, Browning stood trial accused of raping another woman. He was acquitted after the jury accepted his claim that the encounter had been consensual. In later years, he turned his attention to high-value burglaries, but was eventually imprisoned in 1982, where reports suggested his violent behavior continued behind bars. By the summer of 1988, Browning was living with his partner Julie, who, like Marie Wilks, was heavily pregnant. At the same time, he had allegedly been conducting a 2-year affair with Beverly, the daughter of a local undertaker. October 1989, more than a year after Marie's vicious murder, Browning's trial began at Shrewsbury Crown Court. The prosecution case was entirely circumstantial but extensive. It relied on witness sightings, vehicle descriptions, tire mark evidence, Browning's route and opportunity to commit the crime, and testimony concerning both his behavior and state of mind on the day Marie disappeared. Prosecutors painted a sinister picture on that June 18, 1988 day. According to their case, Browning had spent much of the afternoon drinking before becoming involved in a heated argument with his pregnant partner Julie. Known for acting impulsively, he then decided to drive to Aberdeen to stay with a friend. While traveling along the M50, prosecutors allege he spotted Marie Wilks standing at the emergency telephone. It is suggested that the sight of a heavily pregnant woman may have triggered something in Browning. They allege that he turned his vehicle around, returned to the scene, assaulted Marie as she was on the phone, then forced her into the car and stabbed her to death before continuing north, onwards to Aberdeen. Prosecutors further argued that the murder weapon may have been a particular penknife that Browning was known to own and carry during that period. They also highlighted the fact that police had traced approximately 480 C-registration Reynolds 25 vehicles during the inquiry. According to the prosecution, Browning was the only identified driver who could not provide a satisfactory alibi. Witness evidence formed another major part of the Crown's case. Several people, including attendees at his stepsister's birthday celebration on the day of the murder, described Browning as having short, spiked blonde hair matching the identikit image released by police. The prosecution also pointed to statements from 8 separate witnesses who claimed to have seen Browning wearing a blue and white striped shirt similar to the clothing described by witnesses near the M50. Some of those sightings came from South Wales, others came from Aberdeen. Taken together, prosecutors argued that the similarities were impossible to ignore. Browning, however, remained adamant that he was innocent. He denied owning the striped shirt described by witnesses. He claimed the penknife in question had been lost before Marie Wilks was murdered. While admitting he had been drinking heavily that afternoon and had indeed travelled to Aberdeen, he insisted he had never been on the M50. Instead, he maintained that he had travelled using the M4, then crossing the Severn Bridge before continuing north via the M5. That explanation soon came under intense scrutiny. Detectives told the court they had painstakingly examined approximately 1,000 still images captured by cameras monitoring the Severn Bridge during the relevant period. Despite the extensive review, they were unable to locate a single image showing Browning's Renault 25 crossing the bridge. The jury was also shown footage from Browning's identity parade. In the video, he could be seen brushing his hair shortly before witnesses viewed the lineup. Prosecutors suggested this was a deliberate attempt to alter the appearance of his blonde spiked hairstyle, but the defense strongly disputed this. They argued that Browning had simply been combing his hair for the first time in several days using a comb provided by his own legal team. They also emphasized a key point. Of the 9 witnesses who viewed the identity parade, not one positively identified Browning as the man seen with Marie Wilks. The defense repeatedly reminded jurors that no scientific evidence linked him to the murder. His Reynolds 25 had been thoroughly examined by forensic specialists. No blood was found, no fingerprints or hair belonging to Marie was found either. Given the catastrophic blood loss Marie would have suffered, the defense argued that such an absence of forensic evidence would be difficult to reconcile with the prosecution's theory. After weeks of testimony, the trial neared its conclusion. The judge spent hours then carefully reviewing the evidence and summarizing the case for the jury. The jury then retired. When they returned, their verdict was clear: guilty. On the 8th of November 1989, Eddie Browning, the self-styled hardman of the Rhondda, was sentenced to life imprisonment for the murder of Marie Wilks. The judge imposed a minimum tariff of 25 years before he could be considered for release. For Marie's family, it appeared that justice had finally been done, but the story was far from over. On the 25th of May 1991, Eddie Browning's appeal against his conviction was heard before the Court of Appeal. It was unsuccessful. The judges upheld the verdict, leaving Browning's life sentence firmly in place. As the decision was delivered, Browning erupted in protest. "I am innocent. This is Machiavellian justice. I have done nothing to be ashamed of." His legal team had argued that there was no scientific evidence linking him to the murder and maintained that he had not been traveling on the M50 on the night Marie Wilks disappeared. The appeal judges, however, were unconvinced. While acknowledging that the prosecution case had been largely circumstantial, they noted that witness descriptions of both the suspect and the vehicle closely resembled Browning and his Renault. For the time being, the conviction stood, but behind the scenes, serious concerns were beginning to emerge. The case was eventually referred back for further review and reached the desk of Home Office Secretary Kenneth Clarke in April 1992. As investigators revisited the evidence, troubling irregularities began to surface. Most significantly, it was discovered that certain material had not been disclosed to the defense during the original trial. The implications were enormous. And on the 13th of May 1994, nearly 5 years after being convicted, Eddie Browning walked free from prison. His conviction was quashed by senior appeal judges who ruled that it was no longer safe. The judges concluded that they could not be confident a jury would have reached the same verdict had all relevant evidence been disclosed at the trial. Central to their decision was a controversial piece of video evidence. The footage featured off-duty police officer Peter Clarke, who had undergone hypnosis while attempting to recall details of a vehicle he believed he had seen near the scene. During the session, Clarke described a silver Renault that differed in important ways from Browning's car. The vehicle he recalled was a non-hatchback model bearing registration C856H8K and fitted with chrome bumpers. Browning's vehicle, by contrast, was a hatchback Renault 25 with plastic bumpers and registration number C754VAD. Although Clarke testified to the appeal court judges that he did not believe the hypnosis had been particularly effective and that his recollection probably carried little of evidential value, he remained consistent on one point. He remembered was a silver Renault C-Reg car. In a case built entirely on circumstantial evidence, the appeal judges contended that any evidence capable of casting a reasonable doubt on the identity of the suspect vehicle was potentially crucial. They ruled that the undisclosed material could have been made available to the defense and that its absence had undermined confidence in the safety of the conviction. As a result, Eddie Browning is released. The judge went on to lambast off-duty police officer Peter Clarke for not being very good Samaritan-like in driving past a heavily pregnant woman and not offering her any assistance. Meanwhile, the man once branded as Marie Wilks' killer was now a free man. The decision reopened a question many believed had already been answered. If Browning had not murdered Marie Wilks, then who had? In September 1994, Browning received an interim compensation payment of £75,000 for his wrongful conviction. Although he welcomed the payment, he made it clear that he believed it was nowhere near sufficient compensation for the years he had spent behind bars. He stated that he felt entitled to at least £500,000. For Marie's family, the news was devastating. Her widowed husband, Adrian Wilks, publicly expressed his disgust at the decision. He pointed out that while Browning was receiving substantial compensation, he had lost both his wife and unborn child. Adding to the bitterness was the fact that Adrian himself had not even received the maximum compensation available through the Criminal Inquiries Compensation Board, which was £10,000 at the time. According to him, the trauma of the murder had been so overwhelming that he had been unable to complete the necessary paperwork in time. In total, Browning would eventually receive approximately £600,000 in compensation for his wrongful conviction. The controversy surrounding the case only deepened. On the 8th of May 1996, reports emerged that Browning was being sought by police in connection with an alleged attempt to assault his former wife using a chainsaw. The allegation further fueled public debate about the man whose murder conviction had been overturned. Years later, another dramatic chapter unfolded. In 2000, Browning became the victim of a violent attack carried out by former friend and fellow nightclub doorman Kenneth Lattin. Lattin had previously been one of the individuals who identified Browning as resembling the suspect photo fit during the Marie Wilks investigation. According to court proceedings, Lattin forced his way into Browning's flat in the Rhondda and attacked him with an iron bar. The confrontation centered on a newspaper article discussing reward money connected to the Wilks case. When Lattin later stood trial for wounding, he was acquitted by a jury in less than an hour. However, during the proceedings, he made a remarkable allegation under oath. Lattin claimed that Browning had once confided in him that he had murdered Marie Wilks. He stated that this alleged confession had become one of the main reasons for the confrontation between the two men years later. Lattin further testified that he informed Browning's wife about the supposed admission. This claim was never proven. In the years following his release from prison, Browning's health steadily deteriorated. He underwent heart surgery and saw his marriage to Julie collapse. He also accumulated further criminal convictions, including offenses involving knife possession and drink driving. Browning frequently blamed the psychological impact of his wrongful imprisonment for many of the difficulties he experienced later in life. And in May 2018, Eddie Browning died at the age of 63. He was found alone at his home in Lampeter, Ceredigion, after police carried out a welfare check. Officers confirmed that his death was sudden and not being treated as suspicious. Reports suggested that much of the £600,000 compensation he had received had long since been spent. Yet despite Browning's death, the mystery at the heart of the case remained unresolved. West Mercia Police continued to review the investigation through its Major Crime Review Unit. Officially, the murder of Marie Wilks remains an open and unsolved cold case. Over the years, some critics have argued that detectives developed tunnel vision after identifying Browning as a strong suspect. They contend that once he became the focus of the inquiry, alternative possibilities were not explored as thoroughly as they should have been. However, despite the conviction being overturned in 1994, extensive reinvestigations have failed to identify any other publicly named suspect. West Mercia Police have continued to regard Browning as the prime suspect in the case. In 2016, Detective Chief Inspector Steve Tonks formally reopened the investigation to explore whether advances in forensic science could provide new answers. Detectives revisited the evidence and examined opportunities created by developments in DNA profiling and other modern techniques, but no breakthroughs emerged. Nearly 4 decades after Marie Wilks walked away from her broken car on the M50, the questions remain. Who approached the heavily pregnant nurse at the emergency telephone that warm June evening? Who abducted her from the side of one of Britain's busiest motorways? And who murdered a mother and her unborn child before vanishing into the traffic without a trace? For Marie's family, those questions have never gone away. And for investigators, the case remains one of the most haunting unsolved murders in modern British criminal history. As always, at the heart of this story is Marie Wilks herself, a devoted nurse, a wife, a doting mother to a young son, and a woman just weeks away from welcoming another child into the world. On the evening she disappeared, Marie simply set out to seek help after breaking down on the motorway, but she never returned. Her murder remains unsolved, but Marie has never been forgotten, and it is her life, not her killer, that deserves to be remembered. Thank you for watching and listening to Marie's story. Please feel free to add your own thoughts, comments, and theories down below, and we'll see you next time.